In this third video, we're going to look at yet another reason for the Europeans to colonize America. In the previous videos, we looked at some of the economics, the competition between the emergent nation states in the modern world, and the growth of mercantilism, the enclosure movement, and so forth. Well, there was also a lot of religious motivation for colonization, as you're probably familiar with. Now, during the Middle Ages, we're going to go way back here and start. There was really, only one Christian church in Western Europe, and the old western part of the Roman Empire. There was only one Christian church that Constantine had helped establish, and that was the Roman Catholic Church, which was led by a pope in the Vatican in Rome, and you can see the Vatican on the right here. Now, the Christian faith I'd mentioned grew from the time of Christ in the Roman Empire. It was persecuted, and they had certain theological tenets, and you're of course familiar with them. Mankind's inherently sinful, and Jesus Christ was the Son of God who'd died for mankind's sins and had risen from the dead, and you had to accept Jesus Christ as one Savior for salvation, eternal life in heaven. Well, these beliefs had grown, and they were oral traditions. And when you start getting decades after Christ had lived, people started writing them down into what they called the Gospels. But there were a number of Gospels because it had been years since Christ had lived, and there were a number of different oral traditions. So as I noted earlier, as these oral traditions were growing, so was Christianity in the Roman Empire. And as I've said before, Constantine decided to unite the Roman Empire by making the Christianity the religion, the official religion of all of the Roman Empire, a way to unite the people. But then he had to decide which of these different Gospels would actually be the one to form this new Christian church. Constantine helped form the Nicene Council, and they looked at the different Gospels and established a formal church hierarchy, establishment, formal beliefs. And they adopted the Gospels that stressed respect for authority and stressed hierarchy. They rejected the Gospels that were more mystic, more individual relations with God, and they were trying to use Christianity to build up respect for the Roman government. And as I've said, another picture of the Vatican in Rome is the center of this emergent Roman Catholic Church, as it was called. And they had an established religion, the canon of the Bible we know today, Constantine and the Nicene Council had created. The Roman Catholic Church that existed in the early modern era had an elaborate and extensive leadership, and it declared that salvation demanded adherence to its sacraments, the formal and detailed rules of the church. And the Roman Catholic Church believed that without the approval of the Roman Catholic Church, without doing its required sacraments, you couldn't be saved. Salvation was impossible. You needed the Roman Catholic Church and its sacraments. Now, given all that as context, during the Middle Ages, most people, as I said, were illiterate. And on these manors, the only person who could really read was the feudal manor's Catholic priest. And so he would teach to the serfs how to interpret the Bible, the canon that the Nicene Council had created. And he just, that's how the church doctrine was formalized and enforced. It was the Roman Catholic priest on the manors, the only one who could read would teach it. Well, everything began to change when in the middle of the 1400s, again, the humanism of the Renaissance, Johannes Gutenberg invented the moveable-type printing press, and that allowed you to move letters instead of carving out each individual thing used for a printing press. You would have a press where you could move letters around and easily construct more writing. And Gutenberg invented this movable type printing press, which means that books were easier to be printed. Since it was easier and cheaper to produce books, the number of Bibles exploded. And this, in time, with the Renaissance growing and more Bibles, thanks to Gutenberg's movable-type printing press, people began to learn how to read. This is humanism, and they began to disagree with what the Roman Catholic priests had taught. The Roman Catholic priests had said, here's what Jesus Christ believed, and this is what the Roman Catholic Church says, and now they're actually reading the Bible, and they're saying that's not what it says often. So there's some disagreement growing. This, of course, was the beginning of what we call the Protestant Reformation, which, like mercantilism, had a profound influence on why many European countries wanted to colonize. The Protestant Reformation comes from protesting against the Catholic Church or trying to reform the Catholic Church. So it's called the Protestant Reformations. And those that were trying to do it were called Protestants. The Protestant Reformation began with Martin Luther, who was living in the late 15th and early 16th century. And he taught that, all you needed for salvation was a belief in God and the ability to follow the Bible to reach salvation. I mean, you don't need the sacraments in the Roman Catholic Church and the popes and the priests and all that, the hierarchy. Anybody could be saved. But again, you don't need the Roman Catholic Church. Now, that really ticked off the Pope, of course, and so Luther was kicked out of salvation of the Roman Catholic Church. He was excommunicated. But his ideas still spread, and new what they call Lutheran churches began to grow up. And the Catholics would really try to persecute these new Lutheran churches in the Protestant Reformation. Now, a little after Luther, a new Protestant faith emerged in the 16th century with John Calvin. Now, since God was all-knowing, Calvin taught, he already knew the past and the present and the future. He's omniscient. He knew everything. And so he knew what would happen before it happened. And he therefore knew who would reach salvation before they were even born, before they were even on the earth. He knew. People did not know who was saved, or one of God's predestined, as Calvin said, elect, but God did. Now, the people would hope to be one of God's select, saved. It's one of the elect. But they didn't know who that was. If, however, they assumed that one was unholy and sinful, clearly God had not selected them. So this new Calvinism, as this new Calvinist churches, they began to live a really often austere, holy life devoid of sin, hoping that God would reveal to them that they were one of the predestined elect. The Calvinists obviously did not think that everyone could be saved, like both the Roman Catholic Church and, I should note, the Lutheran churches. The Calvinists did not get along with the Lutherans, although they too faced horrible persecution by the Roman Catholic Church. Since most of the new European nations' governments were Catholic, the Protestant Reformation disrupted politics and governance and caused tension, conflict, and often violence throughout the 15th and 16th century. In a general sense, when a religious group found itself persecuted, migration to the New World was sometimes an attractive alternative. There they could practice their faith without government persecution. Now, at the same time, often the king agreed that if this religious minority were to leave, it would not only help him to get rid of a problem at home, but it would also add to the growth of his nation's colonies, which served him in a mercantilistic way. The new religious migrants would only have to agree to follow his mercantilistic trade restrictions, and if they did so, that's great. It helped the king. So, in the broadest sense, this was how the religious turmoil of the Protestant Reformation led to colonization. Now, the Protestant Reformation didn't affect every nation the same. Some nations, like France and Spain, remained solidly Roman Catholic. Many of the Northern European emerging countries, however, were greatly impacted by the Protestant Reformation. The Germanic states became mostly Protestant, as did Holland. Whatever their respective faith, the governments would persecute their minorities, their religious minorities. Only in Holland was there any really evidence of religious toleration of religious minorities. The Protestant Reformation was particularly difficult and convoluted in England, where it played out over almost a century. England remained Roman Catholic, But in the 1500s, a king, King Henry VIII, shown on the bottom left here, found that he could not sire a male heir by his wife. And so he wanted a divorce, which was only available through the Pope and rarely granted by the Pope. And so when the Pope said no, Henry VIII said, well, I don't need this. He saw the Protestant Reformation. And so he said, I'm creating my own church, the Church of England, or as it's often referred to, the Anglican Church, with the king, of course, himself as its head. And so, he founded a new church, the Church of England, Anglican Church, King of England in charge. And so he is head of the church and the state, and he grants himself a divorce and married a new wife. When Henry VIII died in 1553, his first daughter, Mary Tudor, who had been raised by her Catholic mother, whom Henry had divorced, inherited the throne. Now, she was so brutal in persecuting the new Church of England, or the Anglicans, she became known as Bloody Mary, and you can see her on the left there. When she finally died in 1558, her half-sister, Elizabeth I, born to a later Anglican wife of Henry, took the throne. Now, she was Anglican like her mother, and thus persecuted the Catholics. But at the same time, however, she developed a very Catholic-like theology for her Church of England, or the Anglican Church. Anyone could be saved, the Anglican Church believed, but they had to follow the sacraments, not of the Roman Catholic Church, but the Church of England, the Anglican Church. To be saved, anybody could be saved, but you needed the Anglican Church, just like the Roman Catholics believed that anybody could be saved, but they needed the Catholic Church. Now, this Anglican faith that Elizabeth I sort of codified really ticked off the English Calvinists. Remember, the English Calvinists believed that in predestination, not everybody can be saved. God already knows who's going to be saved. These English Calvinists, therefore, they sought to make the Anglican Church, the Church of England, more Calvinist and less Catholic-like. Everybody could be saved. They said they wanted to purify the Anglican Church of all vestiges of Catholicism. And so they became known as the Puritans. Elizabeth I did not like the Puritans, even as she didn't like the Catholics. When Elizabeth I died in 1625, James I took over. A number of Puritans had begun to grow, and the Puritan faith had begun to grow by this point, and James had brutally persecuted them. He also persecuted English Catholics, but as we will see, it was during his reign when a great number of English Puritans fled to the New World. And you can see James I on the left here, and him persecuting the Puritans on the right. The years that followed in the 17th century, they saw additional religious turmoil between the English Catholics, the English Anglicans, and the English Puritans. During the 1640s, there was even an English Civil War in which the Puritans won and disposed of any king. Later, the monarchy was reestablished, but the religious turmoil continued to drive people to the New World throughout the whole of the 16th and 17th century. This concludes the third video on why the Europeans wanted to colonize the New World, looking at some of the religious motivations for that colonization.